Hey guys, I'm Tyson James, back with another midweek Apologetics. Today we're going to be talking about Confucianism, which is a religion that's based primarily in China. So a little bit about China. Today it has about 1.4 billion people, a huge population, and the governing authority in China is the Communist Party. The official position of the Communist Party is atheistic. So they kind of have a strained relationship at times with religion, and so that's going to play a factor in our discussion today. A little bit about why Confucianism is important to me. As some of you may know, I work for a ministry called Reasonable Faith, and our whole ministry is centered on presenting the truth of Christianity to the world. And so my two roles in the ministry are, number one, I'm the global chapters director. So we have local chapters all over the world, and I supervise those and help set up new ones. And then my second role is as the director of translations. So I oversee projects to get our materials translated into many different languages all over the world. And over the last year, I really made it an emphasis to get our materials translated into Chinese. There are just so many people there who don't know Jesus Christ and don't have any idea what evidence there is for the truth of Christianity. And so I've been directing my efforts towards that. So that's why this is really important to me, because Confucianism has had such an impact on China. So I want to give you a little thought experiment on that'll help kind of situate the influence of Confucianism in China. Imagine the USA today, and you know the religious composition of the USA. There's a lot of Christians here. Imagine replacing all of the Christians in the United States with atheists. Okay, just today, boom, they're all atheists. Okay, you would still have traces of Christianity and Christian influence everywhere in the country, right? Charities, hospitals, schools, art, architecture, music, literature, science, the justice system, economics, the abolition of slavery, all of these were heavily influenced by Christians over the years, right? Even to our language, like if you ever used the terms Good Samaritan, or the phrase avoid it like the plague, or that's the gospel truth, or if you describe a traitor as a Judas, or if you say a wolf in sheep's clothing, those are all examples of how our language has been influenced by Christianity. And so imagine America, where you have all of these sort of Christian influences, but the Christians are replaced by atheists. That situation is much the same in China, where the influences of Confucianism are everywhere, just like that, even though few today would identify themselves as being members of the religion. Today, there are very different estimates on how many Confucians there are in the world. Some estimates range between 6 and 10 million followers of Confucianism, but some inflate those numbers to as much as 350 to 400 million. And that's mainly because of how influential it has been in Chinese thinking and living. So imagine somebody saying that they're not a Christian, but they believe that, you know, Jesus Christ is the one way of salvation, and you should do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and that a triune God exists, but they don't call themselves a Christian. Well, that'd be kind of like the way that a lot of Chinese people think. They affirm all of these teachings of Confucianism, even though they wouldn't identify themselves necessarily as Confucians. So obviously, the main figure in Confucianism is a man by the name of Confucius. He lived between 551 and 479 BC, so about 500 years before Jesus. As he was going around and just living life, he observed around him a society that was just in shambles. There were devastating wars, a lot of injustices, social cruelty, broken homes, lack of education and arts. And so he felt that it was his sort of transcendent mission given to him by the universe to bring back order and restore harmony. And so he went about teaching principles that he thought would bring back order and harmony and get rid of all of these problems that he saw in society. He saw himself as a transmitter of sort of timeless knowledge. He didn't think of himself as someone who was bringing something new. He just thought that he was a teacher. And so he introduced or reintroduced what he thought were things that were timelessly true and that everybody can know. He often used this term, the will of heaven, and he took this, it seems like he took this to be some sort of impersonal, transcendent principle that this principle of nature that harmonizes and orders all things. And to go against this will of heaven was to go against the natural order of the universe and to bring on oneself a lot of difficulty and conflict. It's like swimming upstream, right? You're going against the current. And so if you live your life according to the will of heaven, you know how to think and act appropriately in all situations. He also used this concept of an ideal human being as a sort of representative of the way people should act. This word junzi, which, by the way, I speak several different languages, and unfortunately Chinese is not one of them. So if I butcher the Chinese pronunciation, I apologize. But anyway, so he used this concept of junzi, the ideal human being. And he said that the junzi would do this or think this, and then he would compare that to the small man and say the junzi would do this or think this, and the small man would do or think the opposite. So you can compare this with Proverbs, which uses pretty much the same language, the book of Proverbs in the Bible. For instance, there are a couple verses to compare it to. In Proverbs, it says, "The way of the fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man listens to advice." Or, "The wise of heart will receive commandments, but a babbling fool will come to ruin." So there you can see the comparison between, or the parallel between the junzi, the ideal man in Confucianism, and the wise man in the Bible. So in this sense, Confucius can be seen as the Chinese equivalent of King Solomon. Confucius recognized the family as the foundational structure of society, so he focused a lot of his teaching on promoting ideal relationships within the family. He focused on the appropriate affection that the children should have for parents and parents to children, the affection that a husband and wife should share with each other, and also the affection that previous generations, younger generations, should have towards the older generations. For Confucius, religious devotion was very practical. He didn't focus a lot on metaphysics or ultimate reality. It was more important for him to have people live life in a way that restored and maintained order in society. So that was really what he was focusing on. He didn't so much focus on divine judgment or anything, so that wasn't really a motivating factor for him. He believed, however, that worshiping ancestors and performing traditional rituals was a very important way of gaining blessing. So there was this sort of religious element in his teaching. But eventually, as with a lot of religions, the supernatural elements kind of gave way and were replaced by a focus on virtue and moral behavior. So let's bring Confucianism up to the present. It has had incredible longevity. Like I said, it started about 500 years before Christ, and it still exists today. So we're talking 2,500 years. That's incredible. And The original teachings of Confucius, or what's taken to be the original teachings of Confucius, are still widely recognized in China today. It mainly stayed in China for many centuries, but last century it gained some global traction when a man named P.C. Chang successfully incorporated some Confucian thought into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the 1940s. However, at pretty much the same time, there was a lot of change going on in China itself. There was the Chinese Revolution that brought about the rise of the Communist Party in China. And as I noted at the very beginning, the official stance of the Communist Party is that it's atheistic. So there was this rejection of in the Communist Party of religion in general. And so initially they sought to eradicate religion, destroy the rituals and traditions that were part of religious belief and practice in China. So after that sort of initial oppression of religion, there was some reintroduction of religious tolerance in the 1980s. And since then, there have been sort of this cycle of tolerance and intolerance, right? In the past few years, there's been an uptick in religious intolerance. And actually, I personally know some people who have been adversely affected by religious intolerance in China. However, Confucianism is so ingrained in Chinese thinking that religious oppression doesn't do a whole lot to erase its influence. So, as with all of these apologetics videos, I want to compare Confucianism and Christianity. So, I always want to start with what is good about a religion, what we can take away that's positive, because like most religions, Confucianism does have some good aspects. So first, the good. I think there is a great and good influence on harmony, order, respect, love, wisdom, justice, education, morality, religious freedom, and a recognition of a principle or standard of morality that's greater than oneself, that one should aspire to live one's life towards. Confucianism also includes a good rejection of selfishness. We should be caring of other people, not just ourselves. And there's also an emphasis on being rational, being able to think without your emotions clouding your judgment. Confucius was often, he often emphasized that one should quiet one's emotions in order to think rationally about your situation. There was also a really good affirmation that all people have this intrinsic ability to recognize the difference between right and wrong, which corresponds very closely to the biblical teaching that the moral law is written on the hearts of men. It doesn't matter what your religion is, everybody recognizes that there is a right and wrong, good and evil, that the standard of which is outside of oneself. So we read that in Romans chapter 2, verse 15. So those are the good aspects of Confucianism. Now, the difference between Confucianism, or some of the negative aspects of Confucianism. So number one, the phrase that he used, the will of heaven. Okay, that sounds religious. It sounds like terminology that we as Christians would use. But in Confucianism, it was very vague, and not a whole lot of content was given to it. So you don't really get an idea of what that means. And it was just kind of asserted without justification. Confucius would just say, this is the will of heaven, but not give any reason to believe that this was true. So that's a negative aspect. Number two, he kind of talked about the will of heaven as if it was some impersonal principle, like a force of nature. Okay, if it is that, if it's an impersonal force of nature or some impersonal transcendent force, then there doesn't seem to be any good reason to take it as authoritative, right? Here's a thought experiment. Imagine you and a friend are walking in the woods, and you see on the ground in front of you a black sphere. Okay, and your friend turns to you and he says, according to this black sphere, you should live your life righteously and justly. Well, you would look at your friend and say, I don't see that. How can you get that from this black sphere? Well, imagine you make this sphere larger, the size of the Earth or the size of a galaxy or even the size of the universe. It doesn't seem like making it universal in scope would bring it any more, I guess, authority than if it was just a small black sphere in the woods. So there's this sort of intuitive implausibility to this impersonal principle of the will of heaven. Also, if the will of heaven is some impersonal force or principle, then there doesn't seem to be any ultimate consequences for rejecting the will of heaven. Say that you understand that if you go against the will of heaven, there will be negative consequences, but perhaps you also think that you'll get your way. Selfish behavior can often lead to gaining certain things from stealing from other people or treating them unfairly. So say you're just willing to bite the bullet and take those consequences. Well, it doesn't seem like there's any ultimate consequence for living that way, right? After death, Confucius didn't recognize any eternal judgment for those things. And so that might be a demotivating factor for living your life according to this principle. Also, the third negative thing about Confucianism is that it's essentially secular humanism wearing religious clothing. And so humanism says that we should live towards the benefit of humanity as best we can to bring about human flourishing. So without some type of underlying foundation for that, there doesn't seem to be any reason to prefer humanity over, say, other species, or to really justify the principle in general. Why should we seek the good of other human beings if we're all just the centers of our own morality? Then I might want to prop up me and my family rather than the rest of the people around me. Well, that's not humanism then, that's just preferentially treating yourself and your family. So those are some negative aspects of Confucianism. How can Christianity then come in and serve as a foundation for the principles that are good that are found in Confucianism and that Confucius himself wanted to affirm? Well, number one, if God exists, then he can serve as the personal ground for morality, right? Morality is a personal concept. Rocks don't have morality. Trees don't have morality, right? So God, as a personal being, can ground morality. And if God's nature is to be essentially perfect and loving, then his commands have authority, and they are an expression, a natural outflowing of his perfection. You can rely on the commands of a perfect being because he is perfect, right? Number two, Jesus can serve as the real historical ideal human being, right? Confucius talked about the Junzi, the ideal human being, and he used that as the sort of model that the people that he was teaching should emulate or imitate. And so Jesus, as a real historical person, as God himself in the flesh, can serve as that. And we read that that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. We read that in Colossians chapter 1, verse 15. The teachings of Jesus and his claims to divinity were vindicated by his resurrection, which is strongly supported by the historical evidence. So this is a much more solid ground for the teachings that Confucius wanted to affirm than the will of heaven, which was a vague impersonal force. And number three, Christianity can serve to explain why we can all know moral knowledge, why we can have moral knowledge. Um, if we were designed to be able to apprehend morality, having a standard outside of ourselves, then it makes sense why we would have moral knowledge. By contrast, if there was no such thing as a divine design, then it just seems like an accident of evolution that we just happen to be able to perceive moral knowledge or to have moral knowledge. And so Christianity has the intellectual resources to explain why we as human beings are able to know what is moral and immoral. So, like I said, there's a lot of good there, but there's also a lot of bad. And I think that Christianity, because of its solid historical and evidential support, is able to offer an explanation for the moral teachings that Confucius wanted to affirm, but didn't quite ground sufficiently. As in most religions, to wrap this up, Confucianism does provide some very attractive teachings, especially in the area of moral thought and application. I really love the emphasis on family as the foundation for society, as well as the idea that being truly human is a good thing. Unfortunately, however, Confucianism does not provide a satisfactory foundation for its moral teachings, and it doesn't recognize the reality of the impending divine judgment that we all face as a result of sinning against a holy, infinite, personal God. This is a real God who we have sinned against, and so we have to answer for that. So for those of us who are working to bring the good news of salvation through Jesus Christ to the Chinese people, it will be vitally important to understand these differences while also using our shared desire for righteous living as a bridge for communication and building relationships with these people. So that wraps up Confucianism for today, and I do have a bonus question for you. So, atheist professor of philosophy Peter Boghossian has taught tens of thousands of students over the years, and he published a book titled A Manual for Creating Atheists back in 2013. He defines faith as belief without evidence and pretending to know things that you don't know. So my question is, do you agree with Peter Boghossian? If not, what would you say to someone who insists that your faith is belief without evidence? I'll be back next week. I'll talk to you then.